5 months before I'm recording this, English felt like a locked door. Not because I had never seen the language before. I had studied words. I watched videos. I even told myself I would get serious someday. But when it was time to actually speak, everything inside me froze. Simple sentences that should have been easy suddenly felt heavy. Even basic answers needed too much time. And the worst part was not sounding bad. It was feeling like I had more inside me than I could express. Maybe you know that feeling too. You understand a little. You recognize familiar words. You think, I'm improving. But the moment a real conversation begins, your mind goes blank, and your confidence disappears with it. That is where this story begins. Not with talent, not with perfect grammar, not with some secret shortcut. It begins in the uncomfortable space between who you are and who you know you could become if English stopped being a wall. Because what I discovered changed the way I see this language completely. English was never just a subject to study. It was a bridge to the life I wanted. And I didn't understand that until I failed in a way I still remember clearly. So before I tell you what I did to change everything, let me take you to the moment that forced me to stop making excuses. It was supposed to be one of the best days of my life. After years of studying programming, building projects late at night, and dreaming about working for a global tech company, I finally got the email. I had been selected for an interview with a company in the United States. For a moment, everything felt possible. A new country, a better salary, a different life. I remember sitting in front of my laptop, waiting for the call to start. My heart was racing, but I kept telling myself, "You're ready. You worked for this." Then the screen lit up. 3 interviewers appeared. They smiled, greeted me, and started speaking. And instantly, something felt wrong. Their words were fast. Too fast. Not because they were speaking quickly, but because my brain couldn't keep up. It was like trying to catch water with my hands. Everything slipped through. Then came the first question. Can you tell us about yourself and your experience? I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I had practiced it in my head 100 times. But when I opened my mouth, the words didn't come out the way they were supposed to. Short, broken, hesitant. I could feel the silence in the room growing heavier after every sentence. I could see it in their faces. They were waiting. But I wasn't able to give them what they needed. They asked another question, and another. Each one felt harder than the last. Until finally, the interview ended. They thanked me politely. I nodded, smiled, and closed the call. But deep down, I already knew. It wasn't my coding that failed me, it was my English. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Because for the first time, I understood what this language really meant. Not vocabulary, not grammar, but access. And right then, I didn't have it. That day didn't just end with a rejection. It stayed with me. After the call, I sat there for a long time, replaying everything in my head. Every question I couldn't answer properly, every moment I hesitated, every sentence that didn't come out the way I wanted. And the hardest part was this: I knew I was good at what I do. I had spent years learning, building, improving. I had the technical skills. I had the discipline. I had the potential. But none of that mattered because I couldn't communicate it. It felt like being invisible. For a long time, I had told myself a comfortable story. I don't really need English. If I'm good enough, people will see it. But that interview destroyed that belief completely. Because the truth was simple and a little uncomfortable. Without English, my opportunities were limited. Without English, my voice didn't travel. Without English, I couldn't show the world what I was capable of. And once you see that clearly, you can't ignore it anymore. That night, I made a decision. Not a vague promise like I'll try harder, but a clear, almost stubborn commitment. I would learn English, not slowly, not someday, but as fast as I possibly could. Because now it wasn't just about learning a language. It was about unlocking the life I knew I was capable of living. And if I was going to do that, I needed to stop doing what everyone else was doing and start finding what actually works. Most people, when they decide to learn English, go in the same direction. They sign up for a course. That was my first instinct, too. It feels logical, right? You pay for a program. You follow the lessons. And eventually you improve. That's what we've been taught to believe. But I had already tried that path before. About a year earlier, I enrolled in an online English class. Every week, I showed up, took notes, memorized vocabulary lists, and spent hours going through grammar exercises. On paper, it looked like progress. I knew more words. I understood more rules. But when it came time to actually speak, nothing changed. I still paused too much. I still translated everything in my head. I still couldn't keep a simple conversation going. After 3 months, I had more knowledge, but not more ability. And that realization was uncomfortable, because it forced me to admit something most people don't want to hear. Just because you are studying doesn't mean you are improving. So when I decided to try again after that interview, I knew one thing very clearly. If I followed the same methods, I would get the same results. I didn't need more information. I needed a system that worked in real life. When you're speaking, thinking, reacting, and actually using the language. And that's when everything started to change. Because instead of asking, "What should I study?" I started asking a different question. What do I need to be able to do, and how do I train that directly? That question led me to build something completely different. A simple system, focused on action, designed for real conversations. And over the next 5 months, step by step, that system transformed the way I spoke, the way I thought, and eventually, the results I got. Let me show you how it started. If you want to move fast, the first thing you need is not motivation. Taro TMS clarity. Because before I changed anything in my routine, I had to understand what was actually wrong with the way I was learning. And here's what I discovered. I wasn't struggling because I didn't know enough words. I was struggling because I didn't know how to use the words I already knew. That sounds simple, but it changes everything. Think about it. You probably already recognize hundreds, maybe even thousands of English words. But when it's time to speak, your brain slows down. You search, translate, hesitate, and by the time you're ready, the moment is gone. That was exactly my problem. So instead of adding more information, I decided to focus on something much more practical: how to turn passive knowledge into active speaking. And to do that, I created a very simple rule for myself. For the first 15 days, I would not learn any new vocabulary, no long word lists, no complicated grammar, no distractions. Only one goal: take what I already knew and make it usable. That decision became the foundation of everything that came after. Because once your brain starts working with what it already has, something interesting happens. You stop feeling stuck. You start building momentum. And for the first time, speaking doesn't feel like a test anymore. It starts to feel like a skill you can actually train. So here's exactly what I did during those first 15 days, and why it worked better than anything I had tried before. I started with something extremely simple, not textbooks, not complicated lessons, just sentences I actually needed in real life. I sat down and asked myself a very honest question. If I had to survive a day using only English, what would I need to say? From that question, I built a small list. Around 40 to 50 short, practical sentences. Things like introducing myself, asking someone to repeat, ordering food, expressing confusion, or reacting to something. Nothing fancy, just useful. Then I did something most people don't have the patience to do. Every single morning, I read those sentences out loud, slowly at first, then faster, then more naturally. Not once or twice, but over and over until they stopped feeling like foreign structures and started feeling automatic. The first few days were frustrating. My mouth felt stiff. My rhythm was off. Even simple phrases sounded unnatural. But around the 5th or 6th day, something subtle started to change. I didn't need to think as much. The sentences came out more smoothly. My brain wasn't translating word by word anymore. It was beginning to recognize patterns. At the same time, I added another habit that felt strange in the beginning, but became one of the most powerful tools I ever used. I started talking to myself. Whenever I was alone, I described what I was doing. Simple things, daily actions, nothing impressive, but that's exactly why it worked. Because I wasn't trying to sound perfect. I was training my brain to connect thought and language directly. And once that connection starts forming, speaking becomes less about remembering English and more about thinking in it. After about a week, I noticed something I had never experienced before. There were moments, small ones, where English came out without effort. No pause, no translation, just flow. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was real. And that's when I knew I was finally moving in the right direction. Because for the first time, I wasn't just learning English. I was using it. By the end of those first 2 weeks, something important had changed. I wasn't fluent yet, not even close. But I had built something much more valuable than vocabulary. I had built momentum. I could form simple sentences without freezing. I could express basic ideas without stopping every 2 seconds. And most importantly, I had proof that improvement was possible, fast. But I also knew this wasn't enough. Because short, simple sentences are not real conversations. If I wanted to move forward, I needed to train something deeper. The ability to think and respond in real time. So I designed the next step of my system around one simple idea. Speed. Not speaking fast, but thinking fast. And the method I used to train, that was something I now call the question and expansion method. Here's how it worked. I would ask myself a very simple question in English. Then I would answer it immediately, without overthinking. But instead of stopping at a short answer, I pushed myself to go further. I kept adding more details, more context, more explanation, more meaning. At first, my answers were short. Then they became slightly longer. Then they started to sound like actual thoughts. And that shift changed everything. Because instead of trying to remember perfect sentences, I was training my brain to build them in real time. It was messy sometimes, not always correct. But every time I pushed myself to say a little more, I was strengthening the connection between thinking and speaking. And once that connection gets stronger, something interesting happens. Your sentences don't just get longer, they start to feel more natural. And that's the moment where English begins to move from something you study to something you can actually use in a conversation. But there was still one problem I couldn't ignore. Even when I could speak, I didn't always sound right. And that became the next challenge I had to solve. Being able to speak is one thing, but being understood easily and sounding natural while doing it is something completely different. At this point, I could express my ideas better. My sentences were longer. I didn't freeze as often. But whenever I listened to myself, something felt off. The rhythm wasn't right. The tone felt unnatural. My pronunciation made everything sound heavier than it should. People could understand me, but I didn't sound like someone who was comfortable in the language. And that matters more than most people think. Because when your speech sounds unnatural, it creates friction. Not just for the listener, but for you. You become more aware of your mistakes, more hesitant, less confident. So I needed a way to fix that. Not by memorizing pronunciation rules, but by training my ears and my voice together. That's when I started using a technique that completely changed how I sounded. I stopped trying to learn pronunciation and started trying to imitate it. Every day, I would pick short pieces of real English, movies, interviews, podcasts. I would listen to one sentence, pause, then repeat it immediately, trying to match everything. Not just the words, but the rhythm, the tone, even the emotion behind it. At first it felt awkward. I couldn't keep up. My voice didn't match what I was hearing. It sounded forced. But I kept going, sentence by sentence, line by line, day after day. And slowly, something started to shift. My ears became sharper. I could hear details I didn't notice before. My voice started adjusting without me forcing it. And after a few weeks, people began to react differently when I spoke. Not because my grammar was perfect, but because I sounded more natural. And that small change had a big impact. Because when you start sounding more like the language, you start feeling more confident using it. But even with better speaking and pronunciation, there was still one piece missing. I needed a way to grow my vocabulary without going back to the same boring methods that had already failed me. At this point, I had already learned an important lesson. Memorizing long lists of words doesn't mean you can actually use them. I had tried that before. I could recognize many words when I saw them, but when I needed them in a conversation, they disappeared. So I needed a different approach. Something that didn't just store words in my memory, but connected them to real meaning. That's when I started using what I call the story method. Instead of learning words one by one, I grouped a small number of them together, usually 4 or 5, and built a short, simple story around them. Nothing complicated. Just enough to create a situation in my mind. Because when words are part of a story, they stop being isolated pieces of information. They become connected. Alive. Easier to remember. For example, if I had a few new words, I wouldn't just repeat them separately. I would create a small scene, a moment, something I could imagine clearly. Then I would read that story out loud several times, letting the words flow together naturally. And after that, I tried to use those same words again during my speaking practice. That repetition, inside a meaningful context, made a huge difference. Because now, when I needed a word, I didn't have to search for it. It was already attached to an idea, a situation, a memory. Over time, this method allowed me to expand my vocabulary without feeling overwhelmed. And more importantly, it helped me use new words immediately, instead of collecting them and forgetting them later. But even with better speaking, better pronunciation, and smarter vocabulary learning, there was still one hidden problem slowing me down. It wasn't about what I said. It was about how I was thinking before I said it, and fixing that required a completely different kind of practice. For a long time, I didn't realize this was the real problem. I thought my issue was vocabulary, or grammar, or pronunciation. But the truth was happening before all of that. Every time I tried to speak, my brain was doing something invisible, but very slow. It was thinking in my native language first, and then translating into English, and that delay changed everything. Because even if you know the right words, if your brain has to translate every sentence, you will always feel one step behind the conversation. That was exactly how I felt. So instead of focusing on speaking faster, I decided to change something deeper. The language of my thoughts. I started training my brain to think in English, even in the simplest situations. When I walked outside, I described what I saw. Not out loud all the time, but in my mind. The sky, the people, the sounds around me. When I was doing something basic, like cooking, cleaning, or sitting somewhere, I turned it into a small internal narration. Short sentences at first. Nothing perfect, but consistent. Then I added another layer. I started asking myself questions throughout the day and answering them immediately in English. What am I doing right now? What am I going to do next? How do I feel? This might sound simple, But this kind of practice does something very powerful. It removes the gap between thought and language. And once that gap starts to disappear, speaking becomes much more natural. Because now, when someone asks you something, you, Tuam, are not translating anymore. You, Tumamri, responding. To strengthen this even more, I began writing a short journal every night, just a few lines about my day. At first it was basic, very simple sentences. But over time, my thoughts became clearer. My structure improved, my confidence grew. And after a few weeks, I noticed something that felt almost surprising. English started showing up in my mind without effort. Not all the time, but enough to know that something had changed. I was no longer building sentences step by step. I was starting to think in them, and that shift made everything else easier. But I still wasn't finished. Because knowing how to speak and think in English is one thing. Using it confidently with real people is another challenge entirely. Up to this point, most of my progress had happened alone. In my room, in my head, in controlled situations where I could pause, repeat, and try again. But real conversations don't work like that. People don't wait while you think. They don't slow down just because you're learning. And they definitely don't follow a script. So I had to take everything I had practiced and bring it into the real world. And honestly, this was the part I feared the most. Because it's one thing to talk to yourself. It's another thing to speak when someone is actually listening. At first, I started small. Short interactions, simple exchanges, nothing too complicated. At a store, at work, in everyday situations where the pressure was low. I didn't try to sound perfect. I didn't try to impress anyone. I focused on one thing only: communicating. And something surprising happened. Even when I made mistakes, people still understood me. They didn't stop me. They didn't laugh. They didn't judge me the way I had imagined in my head. That realization gave me something I had been missing for a long time: confidence. Not the kind that comes from knowing everything, but the kind that comes from doing it anyway. So I pushed a little further. I prepared a few common conversation topics. Simple ones that come up all the time: daily life, work, food, interests. I practiced talking about them until I could express my thoughts without stopping. Then I did something that felt like a big step. I joined an online group where people from different countries were practicing English together. The first time I spoke, I was nervous. My heart was beating fast. My mind felt crowded. But I reminded myself why I started. And then I spoke. Not perfectly, but clearly enough. And that moment changed something. Because, for the first time, I wasn't just practicing English. I was using it to connect with real people. And once you experience that, learning stops feeling like a task. It becomes something much more meaningful. But there was still one final shift waiting for me. The moment where everything I had practiced finally came together. One day, without planning it, I noticed something different. I was standing in front of a mirror, something I had done many times before while practicing. Usually, I would stop, hesitate, correct myself. But this time I didn't. The words just came out. Not perfectly, not like a native speaker, but smoothly, naturally, without that constant pause in my head. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to myself, because it felt unfamiliar in the best way possible. There was no translation happening in the background, no searching for words, no panic, just thoughts, turning into sentences. And that's when it hit me. All those small habits, all those daily repetitions, all the moments that felt slow and insignificant. They had been building something quietly, and now it was showing. I wanted to test it. So later that day, I joined a conversation with people I didn't know, native speakers included. The kind of situation that would have terrified me a few months earlier. At first, I felt the old fear trying to come back. But this time it didn't take over. I listened. I understood. And when it was my turn to speak, I spoke. The conversation kept moving, and I was moving with it. I didn't lose track. I didn't freeze. I didn't feel behind. And something even more surprising happened. People responded to me naturally. They asked me questions. They reacted to what I said. They treated me like someone who belonged in the conversation. That was the moment I knew. Not that I was perfect, but that I was fluent enough to live in the language. And once you reach that point, everything changes. Because now English is no longer something you, tmaifri, trying to learn. It hamaifutamendrum as something you can use to move forward. So I decided to take one more step. I applied for the same job again. This time, everything felt different before the interview even began. I wasn't sitting there hoping I wouldn't fail. I was sitting there knowing I could handle it. When the call started, the same type of questions came up, the kind that used to stop me completely. But now I didn't rush. I listened carefully. I understood what was being asked. And when I spoke, I didn't search for words the same way anymore. They came. Not because I memorized them, but because I had used them enough times to make them part of me. I explained my experience clearly. I shared my thoughts without hesitation. And more importantly, I felt present in the conversation, not lost in it. You can tell when something has changed, not just by what you say, but by how people respond to you. And I could see it in their reactions. They were engaged, interested, listening. A few days later, I received a message. This time it wasn't a polite ending. It was an offer. I got the job. The same opportunity that had slipped away from me months earlier was now open again. But I wasn't the same person walking through that door. Everything had shifted. My confidence, my ability to express myself, my sense of what was possible. And with that first salary, I did something I had been thinking about for a long time. I gave something back to the people who had supported me from the beginning. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it represented. Every hour of practice, every moment of frustration, every time I wanted to quit, but didn't. All of it had led to this. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. Learning English wasn't just about speaking better. It was about expanding your life. So if you are watching this and you feel stuck, or slow, or unsure if you can do it, remember this. You don't need perfect conditions. You don't need expensive courses. You don't need to wait until you feel ready. What you need is consistency. Small actions, repeated daily. Speaking even when it feels uncomfortable. Listening even when it makes difficult. Showing up again and again. Because the difference between where you are now and where you want to be is not talent. It's what you do every day, so start. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. And if this journey resonated with you, stay with me. There, a lot more I want to share to help you move forward.